Good evening. I want to welcome all of you tonight to the University of Tulsa College of Law. I am Lynn Ensroth. I'm the Dean of the College of Law, and it is a privilege to host tonight Professor Sahar F, who will be our lecturer this evening for the 17th Annual Buck Colbert Franklin Memorial Civil Rights Lecture. Professor Sam Halaby will be introducing our speaker in just a moment, but I want to take just a few seconds here at the beginning to tell you about our lecture series and to talk specifically about our Buck Colbert Franklin lecture tonight. The College of Law offers 3 distinguished lectures throughout the year. Tonight we have our Buck Colbert Franklin lecture. In October we will have our Hager lecture with Orrin Kerr being our speaker, and in February we will have our Judge Stephanie Seymour lecture with our speaker Emily Lee. And if you haven't gotten one of our cards, I believe they're out at the desk. I encourage you to do that. Tonight we are hosting the Buck Colbert Franklin lecture, which honors Buck Franklin, one of Oklahoma's first African American attorneys and the father of eminent historian Professor John Hope Franklin. Mr. Franklin moved to Tulsa in 1921, and he was in the process of relocating his family when the tragic Tulsa race riot destroyed his office and their home. In the immediate aftermath of the riot, he was working in a tent on burned out grounds of the riot, and he brought numerous lawsuits on behalf of a number of the African American victims of the riot, and won a court decision striking down a city ordinance designed to prevent African Americans from rebuilding their homes in Tulsa. He remained an active member of the Tulsa County Bar until 1960. It is Mr. Franklin's commitment to civil rights, to dignity, to giving voice to the dispossessed and injured that we recognize in this lecture series. And tonight, that voice is a voice of the 21st century that our distinguished guest is going to bring to you tonight. Professor Sam Halaby will introduce our speaker. Thank you, Professor Halaby.
Good evening. As the Dean mentioned, my name is Sam Halaby. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty Development here at the University of Tulsa. Really, I don't think that we could find somebody more qualified and sort of more topical to speak on events that are impacting our local, our state, and even our international communities, and maybe even especially our international communities. As many of you know, about a month ago, Khalid Jabara was murdered by a neighbor in Tulsa who, after years of harassment based on his ethnic identity, based on a mistaken religious identity, sort of lashed out at the family in recurrent violent episodes, and ultimately sort of the most tragic episode, all based on a misunderstanding of what it means to be Arab or Muslim, or for that matter, Christian, which is what Mr. Jabara was. Of course, at the international level, or at the national level, we have a political campaign that for the first time in the history of the United States has sort of featured the call for the explicit ban on the entry of a specific religious group, a religious group that comprises 1 billion people worldwide, and the adherents of which are our friends, our neighbors, and the people with whom we share much of our lives. And then, of course, in the Middle East, an area of critical national security importance to the United States, you have internal and violent upheaval from Algeria to Iraq. In some cases, like Syria and Iraq, that violence daily impacts us, and it brings home the idea that we need to understand what's going on better than we do. And with that, I'm extraordinarily pleased to be able to introduce an expert on these topics and more, Professor Sahar Aziz. She's an associate professor at the Texas A&M University School of Law, She is also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution's Doha Center. Her research explores the role of law in social, political, and economic developments in Egypt. She examines the relationship between authoritarianism, terrorism, and rule of law, with a particular interest in the role of courts and judges. Her academic work, which is, by the way, too lengthy to actually thoroughly detail in this introduction, includes Independence Without Accountability, the Judicial Paradox of Egypt's Failed Transition to Democracy, Revolution Without Reform, a critique of Egypt's election laws, and Deliberalizing Judicial Independence in Egypt. She has been featured as a speaker and an expert on CNN, C-SPAN, MSNBC, and Fox News. She's published commentaries in the country's most important news outlets, including the New York Times, World Politics Review, The Guardian, the Houston Chronicle, and the Christian Science Monitor, among many others. Last year, she was named an emerging scholar by Diverse Issues in Higher Education and received the Derek Bell Award, the American Association of Law Schools Minority Groups section. And I'm quite certain I've delayed all of us enough. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sahar F.
Thank you so much, Professor Halabi, for the kind introduction, and to Dean Enzerat for hosting me. I'd like to please join me, or I welcome you to join me in giving them a hand of applause. It is truly an honor to be here today to deliver the 17th annual Buck Colbert Franklin Civil Rights Lecture. As a civil rights attorney and a law professor, working with Muslim communities who are among the most unpopular minority group today, it is a special honor to recognize the noble work of Buck Colbert Franklin. It is courageous lawyers like him who inspire my generation to fight for social justice, because he fought against all odds to defend the rights of African American victims of the Tulsa race riots, among the worst race riots our country has seen. So I'm very grateful for the trail that he blazed and other civil rights lawyers that came after him. Without their tenacity and commitment to justice, many of us would not be here in this room today. But while I'd like to celebrate the absence of racism and xenophobia 90 years after Franklin's historic lawsuit, the facts on the ground caution us against sitting on our laurels. In 2015, Black people were killed by police at least more than twice the rate of whites. Indeed, the probability of being Black, unarmed, and shot by police is about 3 times more than the probability of being white. According to the Washington Post, thousands of civilians were killed by police between 2005 and 2015, but only 54 officers were criminally charged. Of those, 21 have been acquitted, and only 11 police officers have been convicted. Thus, we should not be surprised when we hear demands to reform our legal system. For many Americans, the legitimacy of our entire justice system is in question. And yet, when African Americans exercise their freedom of speech in assembly to protest what they see as an inequitable justice system, they are called thugs, hooligans, troublemakers, as has been the case with the Black Lives Matter movement. Among their demands, the Black Lives Matter movement wants to end the dehumanization of Black youth across all areas of society, including in our nation's justice system and education systems, social service agencies, and media and pop culture. They want an end to the zero-tolerance school policies and arrests of students that is effectively creating a school-to-jail pipeline for many African American and Latino youth. And they seek reallocation of funds from police and punitive school discipline practices to restorative services. Hence, the public controversy surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement demands for reform is misdirected, I think. Criticism is more appropriately directed at our own inability, or perhaps our unwillingness, to pay attention to the harsh realities that have engendered this grassroots movement. For when government fails to listen to its citizens' grievances, the people have no choice but to resort to the streets. Grassroots movements challenging government abuse is not unique to the United States. They have taken root in many parts of the world, including in Egypt, where I was born. In 2011, Americans were mesmerized in front of their television screens watching tens of millions of Tunisians, Egyptians, Bahrainis, Yemenis take to the streets in peaceful, non-violent protests. Perhaps for the first time, many Americans, including those of you in the room, saw Arabs and Muslims as human beings, seeking democracy, economic opportunity, and dignity, the same values that we all cherish as Americans. The tens of millions of peaceful protesters in the Arab Spring proved to the Western world that Orientalist framings of the Middle East as barbaric, uncivilized, or anti-democratic were patently false. Women standing shoulder to shoulder with men protesting decades of abuse and corruption shredded stereotypes of the meek Arab and Muslim woman. The Western media's biased depiction of the region and its people was finally exposed as a fraud. Americans heard Egyptians' calls for bread, freedom, and social justice as a sign of courage against an authoritarian regime that had long oppressed them, a regime that had stolen billions of dollars in state funds to leave half the population at below or near the poverty line. And Americans believed Egyptians when they accused the Mubarak regime of systemic torture of political dissidents, which continues until today. They believed Egyptian youth when they condemned police abuse that pervaded their society. And in those historic moments, for the first time, many of us Americans empathized with the common Egyptians' desire to live a dignified life, which they could so that they could provide for their families the basic necessities of life. We understood that their grievances arose out of systemic and structural injustices. And many of our NGOs worked with Arab NGOs to build up civil society as a tool to reform society indigenously, according to the values and norms of Egyptians, not superimposed by the United States. And no longer did we see Muslims only as potential terrorists, extremists, or fundamentally different than us. We finally saw their humanity that has been there all along and is still there. But we were blinded by our biases and misinformation. But yet, when communities of color or poor communities in the United States protest societal inequities, we become defensive. We discount their perspectives and we marginalize their voices. When African American males are incarcerated in state jails at an average rate of 5.1 more times than that of white Americans, we point to individual responsibility. When in 12 states, more than half the prison population is black, we do not question the fairness of our criminal justice system. Why are we unable or unwilling to examine our own structural disparities? When most black and Latino students attend underperforming schools, we blame the kids and we blame their parents for not being committed to education. And yet, in nearly half of the largest 100 cities, most African American and Latino students attend schools where more than 75% of all students qualify as poor or low income. And in comparison, in only 4 cities do most white students attend schools where 3/4 of their peers are low income. Now, when you combine those facts with data showing that children who spend more than half of their lives in poverty have a high school graduation rate of only 68%. The racial achievement gap becomes glaringly even more obviously a structural, not individual problem. Similarly, the unemployment rate of African Americans in 2015 was 10.4% compared to 4.8% for whites. Yet, we assume they must not be looking hard enough, or they just don't want to work. When all the data points to systemic racial inequality in education, employment, health, and in criminal enforcement in 2016, not 1921. We continue to hold fast to our belief that individual responsibility and meritocracy is the foundation of our society. Why are we so wedded to our national myth that the individual, not society, is solely responsible for the circumstances of her life? As we reflect back on our reactions to the Arab Spring, when we witness people taking to the streets condemning what they believed was systemic oppression, why do we now view their counterparts in the U.S. with the same lens? Why are we so quick to dismiss the grievances of our fellow citizens who work every day and yet cannot make ends meet financially, cannot access quality schooling for their children, cannot find affordable housing in safe neighborhoods, cannot afford health care, and must worry about the police abusing them? Why can't we see their humanity the same way we saw the humanity of those in the Arab Spring, as short-lived as that was? Now, some of you may be thinking, Professor Aziz, it is very unreasonable of you to compare chronically authoritarian regimes in the Middle East with the United States, where the rule of law is more established. And to be sure, our nation's justice system is less corrupt and more transparent. But in many ways, oppression that is clothed in democracy is much more pernicious than the naked oppression of dictatorship. Democratic states are more easily lulled into believing in the national myths that result in apathy. Although they have the right to protest, they waive these rights based on a false sense of security. Worse yet, many citizens in democratic countries frown upon those who meaningfully invoke their freedom of assembly and speech to defend the unpopular, the underprivileged, and the neglected among us. We label them as radicals, as thugs, the same labels given to the protesters in the Arab Spring by the authoritarian regimes. So we should not have to personally experience rights violations or poverty in order to recognize the systemic economic and political disparities in America. Must we lose our homes and our jobs to realize that a full-time job at minimum wage yields only $15,000 a year? Thus, a two-income family of four living on minimum wage working full-time earns only $30,000 a year, which is only $6,000 more than the poverty line, which is $24,000 a year. Must we personally experience poverty in order to discover the harsh reality that access to public benefits is a matter of survival for millions of Americans who work full-time in the world's wealthiest country? And thus, we should respect rather than dismiss our fellow Americans, willing to publicly condemn such structural inequities. In contrast, citizens living under dictatorships want nothing more than to protest and defend their inalienable rights, but the cost is too high for most. Only the bravest are willing to die at the hands of the intelligence services who torture using medieval tactics. Indeed, their torture methods is the very reason why our government turned over terrorism suspects after 9/11 in our secret rendition program, to then be transferred to Guantanamo Bay indefinitely. Citizens across the world living under authoritarianism yearn to openly express their criticism of their government or expose societal ills in newspapers without being prosecuted. And now, to be sure, it is authoritarian regimes who directly suppress their citizens' fundamental human rights. But we too play a role in undergirding their oppression. When our government provides military aid to dictators that use the weapons against their own citizens, we are viewed as an extension of the repressive regime. When our government overlooks their human rights violations and fails to shun them in the international community, we as a nation are viewed as hypocrites. That we live in a democratic society where we can protest, write, and lobby without going to jail makes it all the more reasonable for citizens abroad to disbelieve us when we proclaim that we defend human rights. And thus our international reputation suffers, and it's much more difficult to be on the right side of history. Now, reasonable minds will point out that our nation may cause more harm than good when we engage in international disputes. Indeed, our occupation of Iraq, while deposing one of the most brutal dictators the region has ever seen, has unleashed an unprecedented level of violence. More than 160,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed since 2003. Despite decades of intermarriage and friendships between Shia and Sunni Iraqis, the nation appears to be permanently divided along sectarian lines. Armed militias ruthlessly kill civilians merely for belonging to the wrong sect. And so, as a result, terrorist attacks in Iraq have reached unprecedented levels. The political chaos has created fertile grounds for terrorists to set up bases. And when we dismantled the Iraqi military and criminalized membership in the Ba'ath Party soon after we occupied the country, we gave the terrorists highly trained generals and soldiers motivated to join the terrorists in resistance to what they viewed as a humiliating American occupation. And that is precisely what happened when Al-Qaeda of Iraq was established in 2004, and since then has killed tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians. Former Iraqi generals and soldiers who were in the military under Saddam's reign could have been co-opted into the new Iraqi regime, but were instead marginalized and driven to join terrorist groups whose primary goal was to create as much instability and bloodshed as possible. And while our country did fight alongside the new Iraqi government to fight terrorism, we made fatal mistakes and made the country and the entire region less safe. In direct contradiction to our values and our laws, our government tortured people we suspected of terrorism. Members of our armed forces abused and humiliated Iraqi detainees in the Abu Ghraib prison, confirming to Iraqis that we were occupiers, not liberators. We also housed terrorism suspects together in Camp Bucca, where they were able to plan the beginnings of what would become ISIS, an organization whose violence and barbarism is far worse than Al-Qaeda. And since its formal creation, ISIS has killed tens of thousands of civilians, the vast majority of whom are Muslim, residing in Iraq and Syria. For those who study the Middle East, many of the decisions were rookie mistakes, due in large part to the control of U.S. foreign policy by security hawks whose knowledge of the region is superficial. The inner policy-making circles rarely have experts who are fluent in Arabic or Farsi or Dari, who have lived in the Middle East, or who have formal qualifications to make decisions that will have long-lasting effects on the security of the region and the United States. Among the lessons we learned is that our military interventions in the Middle East now directly impact our lives here at home. The terrorism that has sprouted up from the political vacuum that was created has spread to European capitals. And here at home, inflated fears of terrorist attacks have been used to justify eroding our civil rights and our civil liberties. We are compromising our fundamental values out of fear rooted in negative racial and religious stereotypes of Muslims. But perhaps the most tragic development of the past 15 years is the complete collapse of Syria. What started out as peaceful protests in the Arab Spring has transformed into a violent proxy war between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Western powers who are battling for regional hegemony while hundreds of thousands of Syrians die from both state and non-state violence. And millions more have fled their homes and seek refuge in Western capitals. But rather than offer them sanctuary, our nation has shunned them. As they flee for their lives from terrorism, we vilify them as the terrorists. Some states, including my home state of Texas, have gone as far as filing lawsuits seeking to legally prohibit Syrian refugees from resettling in their states. Texas Governor Greg Abbott minced no words when he stated, quote, "We are working on measures to ensure that Texans will be kept safe from those refugees." Likewise, Oklahoma Governor Mary Fallin called on President Obama not to accept any Syrian refugees. Such statements directly contradict what our children are taught in school, that we are a prosperous country who has thrived because of, not in spite of, immigrants. How do we answer our children's questions about why we won't accept Syrian refugees, even though their social science books state that America is the land that accepted the world's downtrodden and offered them a refuge from religious persecution, political persecution, and dire poverty? How can I tell my children it is because they are Arab and Muslim that the Syrians' pleas for help is falling on deaf ears in America? Have we already forgotten the images of the millions of human beings like us who sacrificed life and limb to challenge their dictators, who receive direct support from our government, which is funded by our taxpayer dollars? Have we already replaced the images of women, children, and men in Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, Egypt, who want what we want: dignity, security, prosperity? Have we replaced those images with the images of terrorists who want to kill them as much as they want to kill us? These are the people that represent the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, not a handful of terrorists. These are the images you should see in the media when you learn about Muslims here in America and around the world. Instead, you are bombarded with images of dark-skinned, scary-looking bearded men and misinformed that they represent 1.5 billion Muslims. And you are not fully informed that 99.9% of Muslims around the world share with you their hatred and opposition to these terrorist groups, and who misappropriate Islam to pursue a warped political agenda. The news does not tell you about the philanthropy contributions of American Muslims. Did you, after the tragic mass shooting in Orlando, that Muslim American communities nationwide raised over $100,000 to help the victims of the Orlando shootings within weeks of the shooting? Was that told to you by the media? And the same media, and this is the same media that bombards us with images of African American males as criminal suspects, while rarely depicting the doctors, communities, lawyers, and successful business people in African American communities. Over time, this reinforces the negative stereotypes of the dangerous, angry black man. And it is these pernicious stereotypes that cause over-policing, hate crimes, and selective enforcement of criminal laws against black communities. Now, how many of us know that African American households give 25% more of their discretionary income to philanthropic activities than white communities? Notwithstanding that as a group, African Americans have 13 times less wealth than whites. So according to a Pew Research Center, white households in the US had a median wealth of $144,000 a year. A median wealth. Almost 13 times the median wealth of black households at $11,000. In terms of incomes, in 2014, the median household income for whites was $71,000 compared to $43,000 for blacks. For college-educated whites, the median household income was $106,000, significantly higher than the $82,000 for households headed by college-educated blacks. So today, in 2016, we bear a heavy burden to continue the work of Buck Colbert Franklin, to ensure our country stays true to its values: equality, fairness, transparency, and justice for all, not just in words, but in practice. As an immigrant and a daughter of immigrants from an authoritarian regime, I have faith in this country. My faith is not based on the dismal statistics that I cited today, but in my fellow Americans who have had the courage to defend the civil rights of African Americans, Latinos, Muslims, and other subordinated groups. I personally have worked arm in arm with Americans of all religions: Christians, Hindus, Jews, Catholics, and all races, white, black, Latino, Asian, to do the difficult and often unpopular work of preserving this nation's values. And I know from personal experience that as much as we have racists and bigots in our country, we have multiple times more people truly committed to equality, freedom, and justice. I know that for every hate mail I receive, and I receive a lot, in response to my civil rights work defending Muslims, I have 10 more times friends and colleagues who stand by me. And I know many of you here today are the vanguards of our democracy. But as an immigrant and an American who straddles 2 continents, I want to caution you not to take for granted your rights. I want to warn you that our democracy is fragile. It is a product of how we treat the powerless, the voiceless, and the poorest among us. Our democracy is not merely what is written on a piece of paper called the US Constitution. Our actions are what breathe life into that historic document. And I want to remind you that we are not superior to other people on the globe. They too are humans with the same flaws that we possess. While many Arabs and Muslims may indeed live under authoritarianism, it is not due to their human deficiency, but due to structural deficiencies in their societies, which they seek to change. And they deserve our support in ways that empower them, not occupy them. But if we allow our structures and systems to degenerate, then our society will become one in which the circumstances of one's birth determines the circumstances of one's death. And we too will then become ruled by authoritarians. When the poor will be poor all their lives, regardless how hard they work or how smart they are, we are no longer an equitable system. When the color of one's skin becomes an impediment to the fundamental human desire to prosper economically and psychologically, we are an unjust society. And when a person's gender delegates her to the lowest rungs of the pay scale, no matter how smart or skilled she is, we are not a meritocracy. So as we gather here today to commemorate the remarkable work of Buck Colbert Franklin, we now hold the torch that he carried. Let us follow the path blazed by giants like him to ensure that all persons, documented or undocumented, black, white, Latino, Asian, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, all races, all religions, in the United States are treated with dignity, equality, and respect. Let us dismantle the systems that divide us as a nation and as global citizens, and let us unite in our universal human desire to be free from oppression. It is through our actions that Buck Colbert Franklin's legacy lives on. Thank you.